Hello there, John Cuturillo here, the counsellor of your listener. Thank you for joining me for this episode. As per usual, thank you to everybody who supports my work and allows me to live my vision every day, be you a client who allows me the privilege of entering into your life and helping you to achieve your goals, or a supporter or listener of the podcast. Thank you to all of you. Today I'm going to be discussing the topic of whether help for the mentally ill and the disabled is really as readily available as we like to think it is. Now, please do not take anything you see on the internet, including this episode, as advice. I'm not telling you what you should or shouldn't think. I'm not giving you a definitive manual on how the world works. This is a set of perspectives that I've gathered from both my own observations and from other people's observations and experiences. Even though we are living in relatively progressive times, we still need to be critical thinkers, and we still need to be willing to examine our assumptions and to ensure that we're not becoming complacent. It's undoubtedly good that we have more understanding of mental illness and disability now than we ever have. We're more accepting of mental illness and disability, we're less judgmental of it, we're more likely to take the time to get to know people individually rather than making assumptions about them. We're less likely to treat anybody who is disabled or mentally ill as dangerous, as myths that unfortunately in some places still exist often attest. And we're more likely to respect people's autonomy to make their own decisions. We're also less likely to treat people in those situations in a coercive or abusive fashion. However, as I'm about to discuss, that phenomenon unfortunately has not completely disappeared. What I'm somewhat tired of hearing is people victim blaming and stating, if you had a problem and didn't ask for help, then it's your fault, you contributed to the problem. Why don't you just ask for help? Society's enlightened now, we have as much help as we need. This attitude is a complete fallacy. And before I explain why, I'd like to explain some facts to you. Learned helplessness is a real phenomenon. Learned helplessness is what happens when an individual has had so many experiences of not achieving the desired outcome from their actions that they believe that to reattempt those actions would be completely pointless. And so even though they are capable of reattempting those actions, they simply want to avoid those actions because the fear of disappointment is so intensive. This tends to happen with certain mental illness diagnoses, however, it can happen to anyone. And I tell you, your mind is a powerful instrument, and you have no idea how convincing it can be when it tells you that something is not worth trying simply because it won't achieve the desired outcome. But what can happen specifically to people who are vulnerable, for example, people who have been abused, who have been raped, who have a mental illness or a disability and are seeking help, is that after a number of times of them being ignored or told that their problems aren't real, the humiliation resulting from those situations becomes so anxiety-provoking that those individuals would rather go without help than risk suffering the anxiety that results from essentially being accused of lying. If you don't believe that's a real phenomenon, I hope that you're never the victim of a crime or otherwise in a vulnerable situation, because you may quickly discover just how real that phenomenon is. But to the topic of accessibility of help if you're mentally ill or disabled, accessibility is not absolute, it varies greatly. Firstly, where you lay on the socioeconomic spectrum significantly affects the type of help you're entitled to receive. If you have the most extreme issues to the extent that they constitute a serious disability, or you have absolutely no money at all, then there is more opportunity to get affordable help. For example, if you have a disability, then you may be entitled to receive funding from the National Disability Insurance Scheme. Some practitioners are able to bulk bill people who are below a certain threshold on the socioeconomic scale. Certain practitioners even provide pro bono, that is to say free, services to individuals who are on a low income. If you're extremely rich, you can simply pay for your services. If you're somewhere in between those two poles, however, help tends to be more limited because you may not be as eligible for as much funding, but then you can't afford to pay for services yourself. And this is one of the reasons why I'll provide discounts to people who are on concession cards, because I know just how hard it is for certain people to access mental health services. What's also been noted is that mental health services tend to be less often subsidised than other types of medical services. So, for example, many psychiatrists only bill privately. A mental health care plan from your general practitioner may allow the partial subsidy of 10 psychology appointments in a calendar year, but often they're only partially subsidised. And 10 sessions in a calendar year when you're severely mentally ill is not that much. It's something, but it's not that much. Often, mental health problems develop over years and years of maladaptive mentality deriving from people's early experiences. It's not a problem that you can solve instantly. And proper therapy can take a long time and takes very careful exploration and patience on the part of the therapists. Some therapists may try to compensate for the lack of time by trying to expedite the process, but then if you try to work through issues too quickly, you miss important details and opportunities for the client to properly learn to independently work with their own mental health. And that's why people often notice that I take the process quite slowly when necessary when I'm working with them, in the sense that I'm gradually educating them about the various aspects of how their mind works. Not because I'm trying to prolong the process unnecessarily, but because often the people with whom I work have problems that are deep-seated. They have developed over many years and often result from trauma. And so if I don't properly take the time to educate people on how their minds are working and how these problems develop and how they're working for them, then I'm missing valuable opportunities for them to properly learn how to solve those problems and ultimately become more independent, which is what I want for them in the end. In terms of the availability of quality help, another issue that concerns me greatly is that we tend to promote rather progressive ideals. For example, we're trauma-informed, we affirm the rights of minorities, we affirm the rights of the neurodivergent, we affirm the rights of vulnerable groups, but ultimately the way that these are promoted are as slogans, and they're often quite insincere. I'm not going to say they're always insincere. There are plenty of people who genuinely care about vulnerable groups and care for vulnerable groups, but often they're slogans. My first point on this is that I am absolutely by no means anti-enterprise. I'm very much in favour of productive enterprise, as I've stated in the past. But in many cases, these slogans are mostly promoted by large companies that provide healthcare and disability services. Let me make a statement that's going to be controversial to some, but we have to admit that there's truth to it. When a company is so large that the central executive officer is in their office wearing an expensive suit and expensive jewellery and never actually gets to see their clients, how much do they really understand the plight of minorities? How much do they really care? Now, as an employee of the social services industry for some years, it was my job to liaise with different companies that provided care. I have seen too many instances of big companies flashing these progressive slogans, but in the end, it is very clear what their ultimate ethos is. Let's make money as quickly as we can whilst putting in the minimum possible effort. I can sense when people's social justice claims are just lip service, just rhetoric to convince people that they really care. Entities that just flash progressive slogans are not the ones that care most about you. It's the ones that don't worry about talking about it, but just do what they need to do to care for people that truly care. I have heard about numerous people's experiences with psychotherapists and had many experiences myself. And the amount of malpractice of which I hear is extremely startling. A lot of therapists, both to myself and to people I've known, have just dismissed their problems. They listen to them passively without properly taking the opportunity to understand what it is that the client is experiencing, or they simply dismiss them by saying your problems aren't really that bad. I've had that happen to me on a number of occasions, and I was undiagnosed for years, and when I finally received my diagnosis, my first thoughts were, if the therapists that I'd had in the past, some of them startlingly experienced, had asked the right questions and been willing to do their job properly, I may not have even developed these illnesses in the first place. Both myself and other people have had experiences in which we have expressed to our therapist that we didn't feel safe or didn't feel like our therapists were truly listening to us. And the therapist's immediate response, rather than taking responsibility for that and taking the time to understand our concerns before then deciding whether it was a misinterpretation or whether they had actually done something that they needed to change, they immediately started victim blaming, immediately blaming us, stating, this is just you projecting your assumptions, this is just you trying to avoid responsibility. When in fact it is the job of these people to help us feel safe. And I'm not talking about them pointing out aspects of functioning that could potentially be harmful. That's also their job. But being judgmental and being patronising and then never even saying sorry when they made mistakes. As I've stated in the past, there was even a therapist whom, when I told them that I couldn't attend their clinic in person because I had to work full-time at that time, but I was able to consult via video conference and was willing to put in exactly the same efforts, they refused to service me, stating, I'm just going to give you the names of some other therapists in your area who might be able to help, but you're probably best return to therapy when you can dedicate time to it. In other words, they were assuming one day you'll be able to take time off full-time work and you should go to therapy then in person, because I don't feel like you're going to be completely honest with me and properly put in the efforts when you're consulting with me via video conference. Again, another therapist who was pushing these progressive ideals, stating we care about this group, we care about that group, we care about not being judgmental, but then when I swear I will put in exactly the same effort and I'm taking full responsibility for this. Their response was, I'm sorry, we won't be flexible. It's about what I feel is right, not what you feel is right. Let me ask you something. People complain all the time about oppressive systems. Okay, these are progressive ideals about these systems of oppressing people, these structures. I was a trauma survivor. A lot of my trauma involved people taking away my freedom and my choice. How are you not replicating the trauma dynamic by enacting what that therapist did? There was also a particular therapist who, I'm going to discuss some points about this therapist, who was perfectly qualified to diagnose me and undertake a full diagnostic process, but was making excuses not to, stating, I don't think it would be in your best interests. I think it would get in the way of me being a therapist. And then they were making judgments about what they thought wasn't wrong with me, and then the therapist that I finally found, who was willing to diagnose me, found that what they didn't think was wrong actually was wrong. So they were completely ignoring signs that were right in front of them. And their response was, oh, well, I don't always get it right. That's literally what they said to me. The same therapist had a number of whimsical tendencies. I attended their office once with a wrist brace on. I'd somehow injured my wrist. I believe it might have been through exercising, and my wrist was a bit sore. And I put on a brace to help it heal. My therapist looked at my wrist and said, oh, what happened to it? And they looked quite concerned, as if they were, I could tell exactly what was on their mind. Oh no, John's self-harmed and he's cut his wrist. I said, oh, my wrist was sore, I just had to brace it. I didn't cut myself, and they looked at me as if they didn't believe me. Literally, I felt as though this person was implying, oh no, am I going to have to put in a report because this person's self-harmed? What if I'm found to be liable? This same therapist also had this tendency to say to me, John, look, it's clear that you know a lot about psychology and you're quite skilled as a counsellor, but you constantly talking to me in psychological scientific language will result in our interactions being a supervision session in which you're just telling me what you know. I need you to be vulnerable. Well, I was vulnerable. I told them everything that I was feeling at a given moment. And then when I was vulnerable, they would patronise me, trying to explain things to me as if I didn't understand them. This same therapist was also referred to in a previous episode of my program in which they were giving me advice on what relationships I shouldn't have in my life. And when I was having concerns at work and told them that I think that I should be speaking up about these concerns because it's affecting me, they dismissed my concerns saying, don't, just stay silent. Don't cause trouble for yourself. That's essentially what they told me. Not in those exact words, but essentially that's what they were implying. So their rhetoric was, we're progressive, we slam down oppressive systems, but then this is the type of message that they send to their clients when they're behind closed doors. I've even heard of therapists not being willing to service clients if they don't give an emergency contact. Some clients have a reason to be secretive about their affairs with their treating providers. Some people have suffered abuse. Some people are in dangerous situations, maybe suffering domestic violence. Some people want to be absolutely certain that no one else knows about what's happening to the greatest extent possible. Again, if you're a therapist, you are serving your clients, but the system requires you to essentially uphold an ethos that we know what's in your best interests, not you. Other people's experiences have reflected this. In fact, I even knew somebody once who suffered domestic abuse and was dismissed by a number of female therapists. It was only a male therapist, believe it or not, who was actually willing to sit down and listen to her and acknowledge that what had happened was actually true. Now, as if these types of events aren't bad enough, I've heard stories from people that they've been abused in psychiatric wards. I wasn't there to see them, but the stories that I've heard, the stories that people have told me have been that they have essentially told whoever was serving them in that environment what their problems were. Some of these people might have experienced psychosis, might have had diagnoses of schizophrenia or another similarly complex mental illness, and it has essentially resulted in the staff there assuming that they're dangerous and forcibly restraining them and injecting them with drugs to help calm them. In fact, somebody was telling me recently how they actually attended a psychiatric ward because they were experiencing a mental illness episode, and this happened to them. But then after it happened, they were sitting down next to their partner, holding onto them and crying because the abuse had harmed them so much. And the staff were telling their partner, do you want resources about where to go if you're experiencing domestic abuse? This person's partner was holding onto them for emotional comfort because they were traumatized by what had just happened. And yet the staff there were treating them as a domestic abuser. This is our so-called progressive mental health system. And let's not forget that there have been multiple instances reported in the media, or I've heard of instances myself reported through clients and through other contacts in the social services industry of law enforcement and other government systems essentially ignoring people's needs. Law enforcement refusing to for example, correct records when they've incorrectly reported on a particular event, or children being abused in foster care. The list goes on. Again, are we really living in progressive times if this is allowed to happen? People with disabilities get abused by relatives and friends who are assigned as legal administrators who are able to make their financial and sometimes their treatment decisions. I've heard of people constantly avoiding repercussions for that. And then let's not forget companies who want to be inclusive, so to speak, and hire people with lived experience, but then demanding of hypothetical employees who are disabled or mentally ill the exact same provisions that they would expect of somebody who didn't have those challenges. So how can you claim to care about people's needs when what you basically want is to hire someone who doesn't have any disabilities and doesn't have any mental illnesses because you can't be bothered making accommodations for them? In fact, I've even heard of people who are disabled being hired and then being reprimanded for not being able to do the jobs that they are hired to do. If you're a company, you know how complex the job is. You know what the demands are. Why did you give somebody an unreasonable expectation that they were suitable for a certain job when they may not have been? Okay, it's not wrong to say we have certain requirements and we need to have people of certain capabilities perform the role, but it is wrong to raise people's expectations and then disappoint them like that and essentially admonish them in front of other people for something that they can't help. It's not their fault that they can't fulfill those requirements, but you as a company knew what the requirements were and you still hired them in the name of being inclusive. So essentially, you exploited a vulnerable person, something that you claim to be against other people doing. Right now, some people may argue, oh, but society's more progressive. It doesn't happen that often, it's just outliers. That's the problem. Statistics are hard to keep. Yes, we do keep some statistics, but then what about all the incidences that aren't reported? Because some people are too scared to report them for fear of repercussions. The fact that it may not happen that often, the fact that it may not happen even in the majority of cases statistically, really doesn't matter. The fact that it's happening and that it's so difficult to seek recompense, to seek redress for these grievances is a problem in and of itself. But if we don't address these problems, we're just contributing to them. So let's start now. So thank you for joining me for this episode. As per usual, what you heard today was not advice. If you have concerns, please seek advice from a professional. And I'd love to hear from my audience. If you would like to give suggestions about what you'd like to hear me discuss on the show, if you'd like to be a guest, if you'd like to be a collaborator, please contact me. I'd love to hear from you. And until next time, take care.